Merci Jérôme. Bon après-midi tout le monde. Alors je vais présenter en anglais, mais les diapos seront en français. Okay. So today I will present an institutional analysis of the ALICE program, Alternative Land Use Services. This is the most well-known payment for ecosystem service program in Canada. It has been operating now for 12 years with its first pilot in Manitoba in 2006. And I will focus on a particular example in Prince Edward Island. So just before I start with that, just to note what payment for ecosystem services. Basically, it provides, it's a mechanism to reduce nutrient inputs into waterways through economic incentives that are given to farmers to encourage them to adopt these practices. On Prince Edward Island, it has been operating now for 10 years. It is the most well-known program of PES. It has the most number of producers involved in the program and the greatest number of hectares as well enrolled. So just quickly, some of the challenges in agriculture. Over the last 60 years, we've seen increasing intensification, as we all know, the loss of particularly the loss of small farms towards bigger industrial farming enterprises. And this intensification has resulted in a severe loss of biodiversity, increasing erosion, eutrophication, as we know. So as in overall, the multifunctionality of these landscapes, of our agricultural landscapes, have diminished while we have increased the pressure to increase yields at the same time. So what is ALICE? As I mentioned, it's a non-governmental organization that was founded by the Weston family, which is one of the largest agri-food retailers in Canada. They are, the family is one that owns the Loblaws group of supermarkets. So the idea is, as I mentioned, to give payments to producers for the provision of ecosystem services, particularly those that prevent soil erosion. In Quebec, the program has just started relatively recently in 2016, at the end of 2016, in Montérégie, around les rivières des Hurons et Zamblourie, whereas in Prince Edward Island it has been going on for quite some time. So just to give a bit of context in the example here in PEI, before the introduction of the Environmental Protection Act there in 2001, there was no regulation for environmental protection within agricultural landscapes, and this resulted in quite a substantial amount of erosion, especially because in Prince Edward Island, potato farming is the primary agricultural activity, and that has quite a lot of impact on the soils. And so there was particularly fish kills were particularly strong in the late 90s. So with the introduction of this regulation, it's one of the most strictest regulations in Canada, requiring buffer zones of a minimum of 15 meters from water courses. It's no longer allowed to plant row crops, especially potatoes, on sloped land of greater than 9%, and crop rotation has been required for 3 years. So this means that there is time to rehabilitate the soil through the planting of cover crops and other forages. Around the same time, 2008, the ALICE program was implemented there, to encourage farmers to go beyond these regulations in a more flexible manner and to improve relations between the government and and farmers. It's seen to be a success because there's now a total of 4,000 hectares that are now under the program there. 90%, more than 90% of all the farmers on PEI are part of the program, but there are other factors that have contributed to it. It's the small size of the province, the vulnerability of the soils, and the fact that the tourism industry on PEI is very closely linked to the fish kills that have happened there. So within this program, this ALICE program, farmers are paid to increase their buffer zones greater than 15 meters, to retire land less than 9% of slopes, and several other activities there. However, in the last 10 years, there has not been any measure, biophysical in biophysical terms, to measure the actual impact associated with ALICE as having reduced erosion. So this is all going from the perceptions of farmers. Basically, the program is monitored and evaluated according to whether the activity that they were contracted to install had been installed or put in place. So here, these are the land use practices, as I mentioned, and the rate of payment associated with each of them. These were put in place in 2008, and they haven't changed since this time, and they were linked to the land values at that time for rental. So, coming to my research question, what can we learn after 10 years of this program on Prince Edward Island from a social, institutional, political perspective? So I'm going to focus on the efficiency aspect, the motivations of farmers to join the program, and some perceptions around the land use practices put in place. In terms of methodology, I carried out 60 semi-structured, open-ended interviews with farmers, primarily from a qualitative perspective. That included about 40 farmers, as well as non-members of the ALICE program, as well as members of the internal implementation committee, which included the potato commodity boards, Ministry of Agriculture and Environment, and the potato processing industry. So the main motivations I've highlighted here, these come from thematic coding that took place. The two main motivations that I want to highlight here, one is the monetary contribution. However, it's interesting to see some of the reasons behind that. So one is that the areas where the buffer zones are being expanded, according to many farmers, are very marginal anyway for yields, and so they were seen to be more financially lucrative to put those lands into ALICE than to actually farm on them. For about 20% of the farmers that I spoke to, they believed that they were already engaging in practices well beyond the regulation, and so now they get a payment for what they were already doing before. So that was about 20%. For others, it was really about a social permit to operate. As one farmer mentioned, it allows us to move away, to shift the blame away from ourselves when there are fish kills, because now we can say that we have done the best we have done. We have followed our regulation. We've even joined onto the ALICE program. So it can't be possibly our fault if there's a fish kill. There are other factors here. There is also generally a cultural tendency over the last 20 years as a result of the efforts of the Ministry of Agriculture and Environment and conservation and watershed groups to promote expanded buffer zones and grassed waterways within their fields. So in terms of the perceptions of the land use practices put in place, there are some positive aspects. Definitely, many farmers felt that the buffer zones and the hedgerows actually do prevent erosion. That was the vast majority of farmers. They do believe that these do provide spaces for biodiversity, while they also potentially harbor spaces for pests, especially the wireworm, which is affecting the potato crop there now. And in terms of the hedgerows, one interesting point was several farmers mentioned that depending on the geomorphology of their landscape, these areas build up snowbanks in winter, and then they melt at the same time, which actually results in increased erosion or loss of soil for them at one moment. Others felt that some of these the buffer zones turn into areas that are that trap a lot of the residue, the pesticide residue within their foliage, and that they wonder whether these are actually spaces that provide biodiversity, as they have found dead birds in these zones. There has not been actually studies on PEI to examine the impact of these buffer zones, vegetated buffer zones, in terms of biodiversity. So that's something to note. Also, the increasing, because of climate change, the increasing frequency of storms has resulted in some of these buffer zones being less functional than what is planned, I guess, before. So briefly, just some other results I'd like to highlight is that 80% of the farmers that I spoke to had installed, put in place expanded buffer zones. In terms of efficiency of this program, almost 80% also added new measures as a result of the payments. So compared to what they would have done if the program didn't exist. However, I'd like to highlight that the pressure to increase yields is very strong within the potato industry there, and this has a very strong impact on the potential success of this ALICE program. 95% felt that the rate is very high, and that was actually their major preoccupation, their major concern was about really relating to the industry and what impact that was having on their soils. So in terms of the payment covering the costs of production, only 41% felt that payment reflected those costs. So in relation to that pressure to increase yields, I want to highlight this aspect here, that 71% were basically claimed without any doubt that what they do when they retire land out of production, even if they're getting paid for it on marginal land, they still have contracts with the potato processing industry there, and those contracts, this ALICE payment doesn't fit into those contracts, nor does it fit onto the broader scale of production on the global marketplace, because it doesn't get recognized on the global marketplace. So what happens is, whether they take out land from production, it means they have to replace it somewhere else. So that was 71%. Of that, 78% of those 71 farmers noted that this was a result of the market pressure, whereas 22% claimed that this was related directly to the regulations put in place in PEI as well as the ALICE program itself. So in conclusion, the numbers tell us that the program is doing very well on an international scale if we compare payment for ecosystem service programs. And even though we don't actually have precise results in terms of the biophysical impacts of this program, but we have to think about this broader political macroeconomic perspective, because the production of potatoes, which is mainly going to the production of French fries, the processing industry, so it's the McDonald's and the Burger Kings who are purchasing these fries, they don't count. The management of the landscape just doesn't count according to those chains. So what impact that's having on the land use values is that it's resulting in increasing the land use values there and causing farmers to have to replace land that they take out of production. So I asked the question: can PES really change the agricultural paradigm, or is it a short-term solution? And so this is, in the next steps of my research, both here in Quebec and in Prince Edward Island, I want to kind of look at the broader macroeconomy in terms of where it fits in place and how it will impact the potential success of this program. I don't have time for this, I don't think, but I wanted to just very briefly show that what I'm talking about this macroeconomy here is that essentially on a global scale, what we're talking about is the land as an input and labor as another input, if we think of the energy and the time of farmers. And then we have this broader productive system of the production of fries for fast food restaurants, which exists outside of that, and that continues to expand, while we have the PES ALICE program, which basically is an intermediary between the farmers and the land, but doesn't really do much to influence this structure. So that's what I want to basically call into question a bit. And this was a quote from one farmer who basically said exactly this, what I'm saying, that the money that the ALICE program provides doesn't disappear, it recycles back into production later, which eventually results in profits for the industry. So you can, as he says, you can save $1 here or there, but focusing on the cost of recovery misses the bigger picture. Yeah, thanks. Merci.
Thank you, Vijay. Is there any question for Bert?
Si je l'ai bien compris, les contrats que les agriculteurs au PEI ont avec l'industrie des frites, c'est qu'ils doivent fournir X tonnes chaque année et que ce n'est pas que l'industrie achète ce qui est produit, mais le producteur doit produire un certain tonnage, sinon il a des problèmes avec son contrat.
Ouais. Afin de garder leur contrat, il faut le produire le montant qui est mentionné dans leur contrat. Mais parce qu'il n'y a aucun lien entre le programme ALUS et leur contrat.
Et est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui est courant dans l'agriculture? Est-ce qu'ici au Québec, le producteur de maïs doit aussi produire X tonnes pour pouvoir le fournir à l'industrie quelque part? Ou est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui est typiquement pour PEI et le Nouveau-Brunswick avec les pommes de terre?
Oui, à mon avis, je pense que c'est plus partout. C'est la même tendance, la même pression pour tous les producteurs, mais c'est juste une supposition que j'ai. Mais, ouais.
J'ai vraiment apprécié la présentation. J'aimerais savoir si tu as essayé de faire un rapprochement entre les perceptions des agriculteurs par rapport à la livraison de certains services écosystémiques à ce qui se passe dans la vraie vie, parce que moi, j'ai travaillé du côté biophysique des choses, puis certains éléments des inquiétudes qui étaient soulevées par les agriculteurs, notamment les dead zones là, qui seraient mises en évidence dans les bandes riveraines. D'un certain point de vue, je peux voir que ça puisse devenir des dead zones où les pesticides s'accumulent, mais il y a d'autres éléments qui semblaient être vraiment contraire à ce que la science biophysique semble suggérer. Donc, il y aurait une discontinuité entre la perception des agriculteurs versus ce qui se passe dans la vraie vie biophysiquement dans le champ. Est-ce que tu as tenté de faire un rapprochement dans la littérature de cette connexion-là entre la science biophysique et les perceptions des agriculteurs?
Pas vraiment, en fait. Oui, parce que selon eux, des fois, ils ont leur propre idée parce ils pensent des fois qu'ils sont des experts parce qu'ils travaillent sur le terrain plus que la science. Donc, des fois, ça rime pas. Donc, mais c'est important peut-être de faire des liens entre la science et leur propre perception.
Dernière question, Barry.
Thanks very much, Vijay. Very interesting presentation. It's not clear to me, however, from what you presented, that this program is actually working, that it's actually achieving what the objectives are, which, if I understand correctly, is better soil health, fewer nutrients reaching the water. It seems to be based primarily on the perceptions of the farmers, as opposed to actually measured results. Am I correct in assuming that?
Yes, and the reason why that is the case is because the regulations were put in place at the same time as this ALICE program. So before this time, there was no regulation whatsoever. So farmers were doing basically anything. They had a free rein in the 90s, and that's when PEI became quite well known for its potato industry. At the time in the 2000s when they implemented both of these programs, they did not do any kind of biophysical monitoring of the program. The program goes purely based upon the perceptions of farmers and the coordinators of the program. So that's another aspect of this in terms of it possibly presenting an image that the government in this case is doing something there, but we don't actually know whether the program itself has resulted in improvements. From the perceptions of farmers, they say that there is improvements, but they also say that they're under other kinds of pressures which might influence that